blockade meant to choke Iran's oil lifeline has not delivered the decisive victory Washington apparently sought. Instead, the past weeks have turned into a high-stakes scramble, a mixture of interdictions, legal warrants, economic pressure, and blunt public threats that is reshaping the fight over Iran's finances and the rules that govern conduct on the high seas. From the start, the strategy was simple enough in theory. Deny Iran the revenue it needs by interdicting tankers, freezing assets, and squeezing third-party partners that still buy, service, or insure its shipments. In practice, the campaign has become a complex global contest, one where naval power, court orders, satellite tracking, and the threat of secondary sanctions all collide, and where Tehran has adapted rapidly to keep crude flowing. This week, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent ratcheted up the pressure, issuing a sharp warning aimed not only at Iranian carriers, but at the companies around the world. First, service them. He made clear that Washington intends to extend its financial squeeze beyond Tehran's borders. He said doing business with sanctioned Iranian airlines risks exposure to US sanctions. Foreign governments should take all actions necessary to ensure that companies in their jurisdictions do not provide services to those aircraft, including the provision of jet fuel, catering, landing fees, or maintenance. The Treasury will impose maximum pressure on Iran and will not hesitate to act against any third parties that facilitate or conduct business with Iranian entities. Those words were not rhetorical. The administration framed this as a campaign to sharpen financial pressure during an ongoing war, and as a signal that the United States is prepared to use its economic reach to isolate Iran further. For global airlines, fuel suppliers, airports, and ground handlers, the message was stark. Servicing Iranian-linked aircraft could carry real legal and commercial risk. At the SAM, for conflict, E-time, the diplomatic and military lines have frayed a month after the blockade was announced. Satellite and tanker tracking platforms show that Tehran has still managed to move millions of barrels of crude. Maritime analysts estimate that several million barrels have been loaded onto Iran-linked vessels since the operation began, with a significant portion apparently breaching the blockade. Rather than a total shutdown, what has emerged is a cat-and-mouse dynamic. Transfers at sea, disabled transponders, complex routing through third countries, and cargoes moving under opaque ownership arrangements that are harder to police from surface ships and corporates alone. United States Central Command has tried to demonstrate otherwise. In a widely circulated social media post, CENTCOM highlighted the actions of an Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer, the USS Rafael Peralta, which it says intercepted an Iranian-flagged tanker. Military officials presented the episode as a textbook, interdiction, and as proof that the naval dragnet is still active. Those visuals were aimed at domestic audiences and at other commercial operators, a message that the US can and will seize vessels moving Iranian crude under enforcement authorities backed by federal warrants. Iran's reaction was immediate and ferocious. A spokesman for the Iranian Foreign Ministry condemned the interdictions as illegal, calling them the outright legalization of piracy and armed robbery on the high seas. Welcome to the return of the pirates. Only now they operate with government-issued warrants, sail under official flags, and call their plunder law enforcement. The United States must be held fully accountable for this brazenly lawless behavior which strikes at the heart of international law and international free trade and threatens the basic principles of maritime security. Tehran frames the interdictions as illegitimate seizure, economic hostage-taking that demands retaliation, and international twainer. Lee Sancha, back in Washington, the calculus has shifted more toward economic instruments and legal workarounds. The Treasury Department announced it would not renew its waiver on Iranian oil purchases, a move that has already prompted pushback from key buyers. China responded with official complaints, and a number of Asian refiners are reported to be scrambling to reconfigure contracts and shipments. The broader effect has been to internationalize the conflict. Sanctions are forcing foreign companies and governments to choose sides, and that diplomatic pressure is itself part of the US strategy. That strategy has consequences beyond tankers. With commercial flights restarting from Iran's main international airport after weeks of near lockdown, Tehran is trying to project a return to normalcy even as it faces tighter restrictions. Officials in Washington warn that resuming international air links could help Iran rebuild commercial ties and generate revenue, which is precisely what the sanctions regime is intended to prevent. Treasury officials singled out the aviation sector in particular, urging other governments to ensure that local service providers do not refuel, cater for, maintain or otherwise enable Iranian flights. The blockade's operational reality complicates matters further. Tracking and intelligence firms report that, even with more than a half-dozen tankers intercepted and dozens more ordered to divert, Tehran has relied on a network of shadow shipping and onshore storage that allows oil to move without the visibility that makes a clean interdiction possible. Experts note that if a ship can be loaded at port and then quietly transfer cargo to another vessel at sea, or if tiles of ownership shift and flags change, enforcement becomes exponentially harder. The Strait of Hormuz, a narrow maritime choke point, remains one of the world's busiest arteries for oil and gas. Sealing it is not simply a naval problem, it is an intelligence, legal and logistic. Al-Wab. Into that complexity stepped the president with a new, very public warning. He told a television audience that Iran had roughly 3 days before its oil pipelines would explode from within, a description he offered in blunt apocalyptic terms. He said what happens is that mine explodes from within, both mechanically and in the earth. Something happens where it just explodes, and they say they only have about 3 days left before that happens. And when it explodes, you can never rebuild it the way it is. It's a very powerful thing that takes place, sort of having to do with nature. The premise of that threat that the blockade could create sudden, irreversible damage to Iran's pipeline infrastructure drew immediate scrutiny from energy industry specialists. They point out that modern oil systems are designed with multiple safeguards, safety valves, pressure sensors, and protocols to halt pumping. If transport becomes impossible, operators typically shut down wells and arm. They protect the fields. They do not, by design, pump until the system catastrophically fails. Independent analysts estimate that Iran likely has months of inland storage and that shutting in production is a far more likely outcome than spontaneous subterranean explosions. At the same time, Tehran's rhetoric has not been merely defensive. An Iranian official warned of proportional retaliation, writing on social media that our math is different. 1 oil well equals 4 oil wells. He elaborated, if any part of our infrastructure, including oil wells, is damaged as a result of a blockade, we guarantee that 4 times the damage will be inflicted on the same infrastructure in countries that support the aggressor. Those words make clear that Tehran sees the confrontation as one with escalation ladders on both sides, and that it is ready to threaten return fire if core energy assets are harmed. Diplomacy, such as it is, continues to sputter at the edges. After the cancellation of direct talks, Iran reportedly submitted a fresh proposal via intermediaries, an offer that would first end the active hostilities and then focus on reopening maritime routes, with nuclear discussions saved for a later stage. Tehran's negotiators framed that sequencing as essential: battlefield de-escalation first, sensitive nuclear bargaining later. For the US, that sequencing is politically fraught. The president's base and many of his advisors have tied the conflict to a broader goal: rolling back Iran's nuclear capabilities. Accepting a ceasefire that leaves the nuclear files untouched is being read inside the administration as a hard sell. Complicating the calculation, Iran's foreign ministry has sought backing from established partners. Senior Iranian diplomats have traveled to meet with Russian leadership to discuss joint approaches. Moscow's role in this standoff, both as a supplier of political support and as a player with strategic interests in energy markets, is part of the wider geopolitical puzzle. Russia, China, and other countries see both risk and opportunity in a crisis that upends global energy flows and establishes new legal precedents for interdiction and sanctions. That larger geopolitical dynamic is visible in the ways third-party actors are forced to respond. Airlines and shipping firms are now making risk assessments, not only about their balance sheets, but about whether their insurance policies will cover confrontations that result from perceived complicity with sanctioned parties. Ports and fuel suppliers are revising terms. Lenders and financial institutions are evaluating exposure. Even when a government does not explicitly sanction a foreign company, the threat of being cut off from the US financial system, the so-called secondary sanctions, is a powerful deterrent. For Iran, the calculus has been to adapt and survive. The nation's logistics chains have become more opaque, its transfers more covert, and its use of third country IC. Mesomedry is more pronounced. Those techniques do not reverse the pressure, but they blunt it. And they underscore a key reality. Economic statecraft has limits, especially when applied against a sovereign state with long-standing networks, regional influence, and plausible deniability mechanisms. The question now is whether the friction will push Washington to widen the scope of its campaign beyond financial and maritime interdictions. Some analysts warn that once economic and legal tools reach their limits, political momentum can favor kinetic escalation. Others argue that an explicit military expansion would carry enormous geopolitical and economic risks, including a spike in global oil prices and a potential widening of the conflict into regional fronts. There is also a domestic political dimension. The president has tied his posture to a narrative of uncompromising strength. That position can constrain negotiators. Any deal perceived as soft on Iran's nuclear program could be armed as a failure for Tehran. Meanwhile, surviving the blockade and maintaining export channels contributes to its bargaining resilience. If Iran can continue to move crude, even in smaller, more complex ways, it preserves options at the negotiating table. So where does this leave the world in practical terms? For the near term, expect more economic pressure. Targeted sanctions, legal warrants aimed at specific vessels and companies, and public warnings to third country firms. Expect to see more creative evasion techniques. Expect diplomatic skirmishes at the United Nations and in capitals across Europe and Asia as governments balance energy needs against legal and political ties to the United States, and expect both sides to posture for leverage. The US will likely continue to highlight interdictions and legal authority as a way to deter others from facilitating Iranian exports. Tehran will continue to frame interdictions as illegitimate seizures, painting Washington as the Agdi. RESPA and reaching out to sympathetic states for relief and political cover. In the middle will be companies that must decide whether the potential profits of doing business with Iran outweigh the legal, reputational, and financial risks. The last weeks have made clear that this is not a short, neat operation. It is not a single decisive block or a simple diplomatic handshake. It is a sprawling contest. Naval assets tracking shadow fleets thousands of miles from the Gulf, judges weighing writs that reach across oceans, and treasuries calculating whether to extend or withdraw waivers that touch global markets. When leaders speak in blunt terms about pipelines exploding or about imposing maximum pressure, they are signaling resolve. But words and legal orders have their limits in the face of adaptive adversaries and global markets. If the goal is to choke off Iran's ability to finance its foreign policy and military activity, that will require a level of interdiction and multilateral operation that so far has proven difficult to sustain. For now, the battle lines remain drawn. Washington confident in its tools and legal reach. Tehran inventive in evasion and defiant in rhetoric. Third parties squeezed between compliance and commerce. Whether the pressure campaign will ultimately yield the swift, decisive outcome its architects seek, or simply harden Iran's resilience and deepen regional fissures, is the central question of this moment. In the days ahead, watch the shipping lanes, watch the notices from finance and insurance regulators, and watch whether diplomacy can find a path out of a confrontation that now mixes law, force, and economic warfare on a global scale.